Three little wooden dolls. This is what you're calling revolutionary art? This is what you're claiming changed the entire industry? The lawyer's voice dripped with mockery as he held up photos of my earliest puppets. These crude attempts that you somehow transformed into a career worth millions? My client was developing groundbreaking techniques while you were fetching coffee. Everything you've built is stolen property. I sat frozen at the defendant's table as he displayed my life's work on oversized boards, each labeled derivative and plagiarized in bold red letters. The courtroom seemed to shrink around me, the air thinning with each accusation. Ms. Preston abandoned her work temporarily due to a family crisis, expecting her assistant to safeguard her intellectual property. Instead, he gestured dramatically toward me. This woman saw opportunity. She capitalized on another artist's innovation and built an empire on stolen dreams. My attorney squeezed my hand under the table, but I barely felt it. 15 years of dedication reduced to theft in minutes. My chest tightened as memories flashed. Countless nights carving until my fingers bled, teaching myself techniques no one would show me, fighting for every opportunity in a world that constantly questioned if puppet artistry was even relevant anymore. The plaintiff doesn't merely seek financial compensation, the lawyer continued, pacing before the jury. She seeks recognition of what was taken from her, the chance to see her vision transform an art form, a vision now incorrectly attributed to the defendant. I looked across the courtroom where she sat. Veronica, my former boss, perfectly composed in a cream-colored dress, her silver-streaked hair pulled back severely, eyes never leaving mine. Not once in 15 years had she contacted me until the lawsuit arrived. Not once had she claimed these designs until my recent museum exhibition received international acclaim. The judge called for a brief recess. As people filed out, I remained seated, too numb to move, staring at the three puppets now sitting in evidence boxes. They looked so small, so ordinary compared to what they'd become in my hands. But what if he was right? What if everything I believed about my talent was built on someone else's foundation? I didn't know then that by tomorrow, I would uncover a truth so devastating it would change everything. I couldn't have guessed that the real story began long before I ever met Veronica, or that my revenge would be served not with malice, but with a revelation that would silence the entire courtroom. If you're captivated by this story of betrayal and wondering how it unfolds, please hit the like button and subscribe to my channel for more riveting tales of justice and vengeance. Drop a comment with your thoughts on what might be inside that mysterious envelope. Your support helps me continue creating these stories that keep you on the edge of your seat. Now, let's dive deeper into how this all began. My name is Diana. Before the lawsuit, before the fame, before the three puppets changed my life, I was just a quiet artist seeking my place in the world. People often described me as intensely observant. I noticed details others missed, from the subtle shifts in facial expressions to the way light transformed ordinary objects into something magical. This sensitivity made me an outsider growing up, but became my greatest strength as an artist. I came to the Moonlight Theater Company fresh out of art school, hired as a general assistant with no specific artistic role. The theater was housed in a converted warehouse with high ceilings and massive windows that flooded the space with natural light. Despite its impressive architecture, the company operated on a shoestring budget, producing experimental shows that rarely drew large crowds but maintained a devoted following among avant-garde theater enthusiasts. Veronica ruled this small kingdom with absolute authority. Tall and imposing, with penetrating green eyes that seemed to evaluate your worth in seconds, she had built a reputation for creating visually stunning productions that pushed boundaries. Everyone spoke of her in reverent whispers, and I considered myself impossibly lucky to work under her guidance. "You have good hands," she told me during my interview, studying my fingers with unusual intensity. "Steady, patient. That's rare these days." For 3 months, I did whatever was needed. Painted sets, organized costumes, delivered messages between departments, and spent hours watching Veronica work from a respectful distance. She rarely acknowledged my presence, but I absorbed everything: her techniques, her artistic decisions, her management style that alternated between brilliant inspiration and cold dismissal. The company was preparing for its most ambitious production yet, an experimental piece called Forgotten Whispers that would combine human actors with life-size puppets, representing memory and dream. Veronica had been secretive about the puppet designs, working alone in her studio at the back of the building, refusing to show anyone her progress. That Tuesday began like any other. I arrived early, organized the day's schedules, and prepared coffee for the morning production meeting. The theater hummed with activity, carpenters hammering at the set, actors warming up their voices in scattered corners, lighting technicians adjusting instruments above. I was alone at my small desk when Veronica appeared suddenly beside me, arms cradling 3 partially completed puppets. Without preamble, she placed them on my desk. "Keep an eye on these until I get back," she said, already turning to leave. 2 hours, max. The puppets were unlike anything I'd seen before, not fully formed but clearly showing revolutionary potential. The first had a face half carved from pale wood, features emerging like a face pushing through water, with joints that seemed to float rather than connect. The second was smaller, with fabric stretched over a wire frame in a way that suggested both fragility and fluidity. The third was the most complete, a nearly finished figure with intricate hand detailing and eyes that seemed to follow movement. I sat motionless, afraid to touch them, only allowing myself to study how each was constructed. The techniques were unfamiliar, not the standard approaches taught in my classes or shown in the reference books I'd studied. These puppets seemed alive even in their unfinished state, each joint and connection designed to move with uncanny naturalism. 2 hours passed, then 4. By evening, the theater director, Henry, came looking for Veronica. "Where is she? We need decisions on the backdrop projections today." She left these with me," I explained, gesturing to the puppets. "Said she'd be back in 2 hours. That was this morning." Henry frowned, pulling out his phone to call her again. After a brief conversation, his expression darkened. "She says there's a family emergency. She's taken immediate leave and won't be back for the production." The news rippled through the company like an earthquake. Veronica had never missed a production, had never abandoned a project mid-creation. Emergency meetings were called, roles reassigned. The show, scheduled to open in 3 weeks, suddenly had no artistic director. As everyone scattered to salvage what they could, I sat alone with the puppets, uncertain what to do with them. "Henry," I called as he rushed past. "What about these? They're for the show, but they're not finished." He stopped, running a hand through his thinning hair, looking at the puppets with weary resignation. "Finish them or find replacements," he shrugged. "Your call. We need something by next week." That night, after everyone left, I stayed behind, examining the puppets under the work lights. I had basic crafting skills but had never attempted puppet construction of this complexity. Still, with the show in jeopardy and no one else volunteering, I had little choice. I began with simple research, visiting the theater's small library and searching online for puppet-making techniques. Nothing I found matched what Veronica had started. These puppets employed methods I couldn't identify, joints that allowed movement I'd never seen, facial structures that seemed to change expression with the slightest tilt. For 3 days, I barely slept, attempting to understand what she had begun. On the 4th night, in desperation, I made a decision that would alter my life's course. I would start over, not trying to copy Veronica's unknown techniques, but developing my own approach, based on what these unfinished pieces inspired in me. I kept the basic designs but reimagined their mechanics. Where Veronica had used a complex joint system I couldn't replicate, I created a simpler but equally effective alternative. Where her facial carving technique eluded me, I developed a layered approach that achieved similar expressiveness. The fabric puppet I completely reimagined, using a technique I invented through trial and error involving heat-shaped materials and strategic stitching. For 2 weeks, I worked through nights and weekends, my hands blistered, then calloused. I learned to carve wood by practicing on scraps until my cuts became precise. I studied movement by watching dancers rehearse, translating human grace into mechanical possibility. What emerged were not copies of Veronica's concepts, but something new, puppets that carried the ghost of her original vision but expressed through my developing voice. When I finally brought them to rehearsal, the cast fell silent. "These are," Henry began, then stopped, wordless for perhaps the first time since I'd known him. The lead actress approached slowly, extending a hand toward the largest puppet. "May I?" I nodded, and she lifted it, testing its movement. The puppet seemed to come alive in her hands, responding to the slightest manipulation with fluid, almost breathing motion. "They're better than what Veronica described," she whispered. They have souls." Opening night arrived with the nervous energy that accompanies all theatrical premieres. I stood backstage, watching through a gap in the curtains as the audience filled our small theater. The puppets waited on their stands, finished and perfect, no longer bearing any obvious connection to the half-formed figures Veronica had abandoned. The house lights dimmed, music swelled, and when the first puppet appeared on stage, moving with the actress as if they shared one mind, I heard the collective gasp of the audience. Something awakened in me then, a recognition of my true calling. The show received standing ovations and the best reviews in the company's history. Critics specifically mentioned the revolutionary puppet design that transcends the medium. No one knew they were my creation. The program credited Moonlight Theater Collective for all design elements. As the cast celebrated at the opening night party, Henry found me hiding in the back of the room. "Those puppets," he said, studying me with new interest. "Veronica didn't make those, did she?" I hesitated, uncertain how to answer. "No," I finally admitted. "I couldn't figure out her techniques. I had to create my own." He nodded slowly. "You should take credit, Diana. This is the beginning of something important." I didn't know then how prophetic his words would be, or how those 3 puppets would eventually bring Veronica back into my life with devastating consequences. I couldn't have imagined that 15 years later, I would stand in a courtroom, fighting for my artistic legacy against the woman who had unwittingly set me on my path. And I had no way of knowing that the envelope I would eventually hand to the judge contained something far more personal than evidence of artistic ownership, something that would change not just the outcome of the trial, but the very story of who I was. I never meant to make puppetry my life's work. After the success of Forgotten Whispers, I returned to my assistant duties, expecting things to return to normal when Veronica came back. But weeks passed, then months. Henry offered me a small role designing puppets for their next production, a children's show that typically used simple store-bought marionettes. "Show me what you can do with a proper budget this time," he said, handing me a small sum that felt like a fortune after scraping by on art store clearance bins. Those first puppets I created intentionally, characters of my own design rather than emergency replacements, caught the attention of a visiting director from a larger theater. She commissioned me to create a series for her upcoming production, offering triple what Henry could pay. "You can't leave," Henry protested when I showed him the offer letter. "We need you here." "I'm not leaving," I assured him. "I can do both." And for a while, I did. By day, I continued my assistant work at Moonlight. By night, I built my first professional puppet collection in my tiny apartment. Word spread quickly in the close-knit theater community. Within a year, I was receiving commissions from 3 different states. I converted my living room into a workshop, sleeping on a futon tucked into the corner. My dining table became my carving station. My kitchen counters held paints and finishes. I developed my signature style through constant experimentation. Puppets with mechanisms so subtle audiences forgot they weren't alive, expressions that changed with lighting and angle, movements that captured human emotion with uncanny precision. The pivotal moment came when the National Theater Festival selected one of my pieces for their annual showcase. Theater professionals from across the country would see my work. I needed something spectacular. I created Remembrance, a puppet depicting an elderly woman whose face contained layers of younger versions visible in certain lights, a physical manifestation of memory and aging. When manipulated, she moved with the fragility of age but occasionally slipped into the fluid motion of youth, as if momentarily remembering her former self. After the showcase, a museum curator approached me. "We're planning an exhibition on innovative puppetry," she said. "Your work represents exactly the direction we want to highlight." That first museum exhibition led to others. Articles were written. A documentary filmmaker followed me for 6 months. I established a small studio, hired apprentices, taught workshops. I developed a reputation for innovation in an art form many considered outdated. Throughout those 15 years, I never heard from Veronica. Occasionally, someone from the theater world mentioned running into her in Chicago or Seattle, always with a new project, never staying anywhere long. I thought of her less and less as years passed, the memory of those original 3 puppets fading behind the hundreds I'd created since. Then came the letter. I was in my studio supervising final touches on a commission for an international theater festival when my assistant brought in the mail. "This one's certified," she said, holding out an envelope. "Had to sign for it." The return address showed a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was formal notice of a lawsuit filed by Veronica Preston against me personally and my studio as a business entity, claiming intellectual property theft, design infringement, and damages totaling millions. The documents alleged that the 3 puppets she'd left with me contained proprietary design elements and techniques she'd been developing for years. According to her claim, every puppet I'd created since utilized her innovative methods without attribution or compensation. She demanded not just financial restitution, but public acknowledgement that my entire career stemmed from her work. Attached were dated sketches showing puppet designs with similarities to my style, along with technical drawings of joint systems and facial mechanisms that indeed resembled some I used. I called Henry immediately, my voice shaking. "Did you know about this? Did you know she was developing these techniques before she left?" "Diana, that was 15 years ago," he sighed. "But no, none of us knew what she was working on. She was always secretive. The theater must have records of what happened, how she left, what she said about coming back. The ownership changed 5 years ago, remember? Most of those records are gone. And I'm retired now. I can testify about what I remember, but..." His voice trailed off, and I understood the problem. Memories fade, people move on, documentation disappears. What remained were her dated sketches against my word. I hired the best intellectual property attorney I could afford, who immediately requested all Veronica's evidence. What came back chilled me. She had detailed notebooks dating back 18 years, showing the development of techniques remarkably similar to ones I used. She had testimonials from former colleagues claiming she had discussed her revolutionary puppet concepts before her departure. Most damning, she had photographs of the original 3 unfinished puppets, showing structural elements that did appear in my later work. Could she have created these records after the fact? I asked my lawyer. "The notebooks are date-stamped and notarized," he said grimly. "The photographs were digitally authenticated. It's going to be hard to prove fabrication." "But she abandoned those puppets," I insisted. "She left without a word for 15 years. Abandonment doesn't automatically transfer intellectual property rights," he explained. "And she claims the family emergency was caring for her mother with dementia, a sympathetic reason for her absence." The lawsuit quickly made industry news. Headlines questioned my originality. Former admirers distanced themselves. Commissions were put on hold, pending resolution. 15 years of reputation building began unraveling in weeks. The case proceeded with crushing momentum. Veronica's lawyers presented expert witnesses who highlighted the similarities between her early sketches and my established techniques. They displayed side-by-side comparisons of joint mechanisms, facial construction methods, and movement systems that showed undeniable resemblances. My own experts argued that these similarities represented natural evolutions in puppet design rather than direct copies, but their testimony seemed weak against the mountain of dated documentation Veronica provided. During her testimony, Veronica played her role perfectly, the innovative artist whose moment of crisis had created vulnerability her assistant exploited. "I never imagined she would take my unfinished concepts and claim them as her own," Veronica said, voice trembling just enough to convey genuine hurt. "I was dealing with my mother's rapid decline, making impossible choices between my career and family duty. I trusted Diana to safeguard my work, not build her career on it." As she spoke, I studied her face, searching for the woman I had once admired so intensely. She had aged beautifully, silver streaking her dark hair, fine lines adding character to her striking features. Her hands still moved with the precise grace I remembered, gesturing to emphasize points as she testified. These were the hands that had created those original puppets. Or had they? A strange memory surfaced as I watched her. Something about the way she had examined my hands during my interview, commenting on their steadiness. At the time, I'd taken it as professional assessment, but now it felt different, as if she had been evaluating me for something specific. That night, unable to sleep, I pulled out old photos from my first days at the theater. In one group shot, I noticed something in the background, a calendar hanging on the wall with a local puppet theater's performance schedule. Something about that theater's name triggered a vague recollection. I spent hours searching online until I found what I was looking for. An old newspaper article about a small puppet theater that had operated 30 years earlier, run by a married couple known for their innovative designs. The article mentioned their tragic deaths in a workshop fire, leaving behind a 5-year-old daughter. There was a photo of the couple holding puppets with hauntingly familiar construction. My hands started shaking as I studied their faces, looking for something I couldn't name. The woman had my eyes. The man, my smile. I called my attorney at 3 a.m. "I need to find out if I was adopted," I said without preamble. "Diana, it's the middle of the night. What does this have to do with everything?" I interrupted. "It might have everything to do with the case." The following days became a frantic search through records I'd never thought to examine. My parents, the people who raised me, had passed away years ago. They had never mentioned adoption, but they'd also been notably silent about my early childhood. With my lawyer's help, I obtained my birth certificate. It listed different parents than those who raised me. Further digging revealed adoption papers processed when I was 5 years old, the same age as the puppet maker's orphan daughter. The evidence accumulated with sickening clarity. The puppeteers who died in that fire were my birth parents. Their innovative techniques had died with them, or would have if not for the 3 unfinished puppets that somehow survived the fire. The final confirmation came from an elderly puppeteer I tracked down who had known my birth parents. Those 3 pieces were their masterworks in progress, he told me during a video call, his voice quavering with age. They were developing a completely new approach to movement and expression. Everyone in our small community knew about them, though few had seen them. After the fire, those puppets disappeared. We assumed they'd burned too. "How would someone outside your community know about them?" I asked. "There was a journalist doing a story on innovative puppet design," he recalled. "Interviewed several artists, including your parents. The article never published, the magazine folded, but she saw the unfinished pieces during her research. Do you remember her name?" He thought for a moment. "Something with a V. Victoria? Valerie? Veronica?" I suggested, my stomach dropping. "Yes, that's it." Ambitious young woman, asked very technical questions. The courthouse felt cavernous as I entered for what would likely be the final day of trial. Veronica sat confidently at the plaintiff's table, occasionally whispering to her attorneys. The gallery was packed with industry professionals and journalists, all expecting to witness my professional downfall. My attorney had begged me to accept a settlement offer that had arrived that morning, a generous proposal allowing me to continue working if I publicly credited Veronica as the originator of my techniques and paid her substantial royalties on all past and future work. "We don't have enough to win," he had insisted. "The documented evidence is too strong." But I had one piece of evidence left to the envelope I now carried. When the judge called the court to order, my attorney began his closing statement, emphasizing my independent development as an artist, while acknowledging the circumstantial similarities between my work and Veronica's documented designs. As he concluded, I stood. "Your Honor, I have additional evidence I'd like to submit." The judge frowned. "Counselor, discovery is complete. Why wasn't this submitted earlier?" "I only obtained final verification last night," I explained, approaching the bench with the sealed envelope. After some debate and over objections from Veronica's attorneys, the judge agreed to review the contents. He opened the envelope carefully, studied each item inside, then looked up with an expression of profound surprise. "Do they know what's inside?" he asked quietly, gesturing toward Veronica and her legal team. "Not yet," I replied. As I turned to face the courtroom, I saw Veronica's confident expression waver slightly. She couldn't know what I had discovered, couldn't know that her carefully constructed case was about to collapse. But something in my face must have signaled the turning tide. I had no idea that my words would not only save my career, but would uncover a theft far more profound than artistic techniques. Identity. The theft of my very identity. And I couldn't have imagined that my revenge would come not through destroying Veronica, but through reclaiming what was always mine. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to reveal what the envelope contained, evidence that would transform everything we thought we knew about this case, about Veronica, and about me. The judge handed the documents back to me, nodding permission to proceed. I turned to face the packed courtroom, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become. Even the usual shuffling and whispers had ceased, as if everyone sensed the importance of what was about to happen. "Your Honor, members of the court," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "I'd like to present 3 items that tell the true story of these puppets." I held up the first document. "This is a birth certificate for Diana Merrick, born to Thomas and Eleanor Merrick 35 years ago." I placed it on the evidence table. These were my birth parents. Next, I lifted a yellowed newspaper clipping. This is an obituary from 30 years ago, reporting the deaths of Thomas and Eleanor Merrick in a workshop fire. They were renowned puppet makers, known for pioneering techniques in movement and expression. I set it beside the birth certificate. I was 5 years old when they died. Finally, I revealed the third document, a small article with a faded photograph. This is from a local arts newsletter, published 1 month before their deaths. It mentions 3 revolutionary puppet designs the Merricks were developing, pieces that would transform the art form. According to this article, these puppets weren't kept in their main workshop but in a separate studio where they taught occasional classes. I looked directly at Veronica for the first time. Her face had gone completely still, her eyes locked on the documents. The fire that killed my parents destroyed their main workshop. I was adopted by family friends who never spoke about my birth parents, perhaps thinking it would be less painful for me to forget. I grew up not knowing who I was or where I came from. The judge leaned forward. "And how does this relate to the puppets in question, Miss Merrick?" "That's said, as in of causanem as Merrick." I pointed to the final page in the evidence packet, a signed affidavit. This statement is from Martin Weber, a puppet maker who knew my parents well. He confirms that Veronica Preston, then an arts journalist researching innovative puppet design, interviewed my parents 2 months before their deaths. She saw the 3 unfinished puppets and took extensive notes on their construction. Veronica's attorney jumped to his feet. "Objection, this is hearsay and irrelevant to the intellectual property claim." "On the contrary," my attorney countered, "it goes directly to the provenance of the designs Ms. Preston claims as her own." The judge overruled the objection, motioning for me to continue. After my parents died, those 3 puppets disappeared. Everyone assumed they had been destroyed, but they hadn't. I turned to face Veronica directly. "You tracked them down, didn't you? You discovered they had been stored at the teaching studio, not in the main workshop that burned." Veronica's composure finally cracked, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. "You spent years finding them, then purchased them from a distant relative who had no idea of their significance. And when you became artistic director at Moonlight Theater, you did one more thing." I took a deep breath. "You searched for me." Whispers erupted around the courtroom. "The timing wasn't coincidence. You hired me 3 months after I graduated from art school, after seeing my student work in a showcase. You knew exactly who I was, the daughter of the innovative puppet makers whose techniques you coveted. You wanted to see if I had inherited their talent." The judge raised his hand. "Ms. Merrick, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence that Ms. Preston knew your identity?" I nodded, retrieving one final document from the envelope. "This is my employment application from Moonlight Theater. You'll notice my emergency contact was my adoptive aunt, Sarah Reynolds. On the back is a note in Veronica's handwriting asking the personnel manager to verify the connection between Sarah Reynolds and the Merrick family." The courtroom fell silent as the judge examined the document. "When you placed those 3 puppets on my desk 15 years ago, I said, looking at Veronica, "you weren't just abandoning some unfinished projects. You were returning my birthright to me. You wanted to see what I would do with them, if I would instinctively understand their construction the way my parents had." Veronica's attorney was frantically whispering to her, but she brushed him off, her eyes never leaving mine. "What I don't understand," I continued, "is why you came back now. Why sue me after all these years? These techniques were never yours to claim." For the first time, Veronica spoke directly to me rather than through her attorneys. "Because you surpassed them," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the silent courtroom. "Your parents were brilliant, but you took their foundation further than they ever could have. I watched your career from a distance, waiting to see if you'd reach your potential." She stood, ignoring her lawyer's attempt to pull her back. "The techniques in those original puppets were revolutionary, but limited. I spent years trying to develop them myself with no success. But you understood them instinctively and evolved them beyond anything I imagined possible. So this lawsuit was, what? Jealousy?" the judge asked. Veronica shook her head. "Recognition. I wanted the world to know these techniques had origins, that they came from somewhere, from someone. From my parents," I said, "not from you." "I preserved what would have been lost," she countered, a hint of desperation entering her voice. "I saved those puppets when no one else cared. I brought them back to their rightful heir when I could have kept them hidden forever." The judge had heard enough. "Miss Preston, are you admitting that you claimed ownership of designs that weren't yours?" Her attorney tried to intervene, but Veronica silenced him with a gesture. "I'm saying I protected an artistic legacy. I ensured these techniques survived. By attempting to take credit for them, the judge noted, by suing their rightful inheritor for millions of dollars. The remaining proceedings happened rapidly. The judge not only dismissed Veronica's case, but directed the court clerk to forward evidence to the district attorney for potential fraud charges. He issued a declaratory judgment affirming my rights to all my artistic works and techniques. As the courtroom began to empty, Veronica approached me, her lawyers trailing behind, clearly distressed by her actions. "They would be proud of you," she said softly. "I knew the moment I saw your hands. You have your father's hands. The way you hold tools, the precision of your movements, it's genetic." "You could have told me," I replied, the anger I'd expected to feel strangely absent. "You could have shared their story with me instead of trying to steal it. Would you have believed me? A stranger telling you your entire identity was different than you thought? I considered this. Maybe not, but you didn't even try." She nodded, accepting this truth. "When I saw what you created from those unfinished pieces, how quickly you solved problems that had stumped me for years, I knew you were truly their daughter. I should have walked away then." "Why didn't you?" She glanced around at the reporters, hovering nearby, hungry for quotes. "I convinced myself I deserved recognition too, for preserving their work, for connecting you to your legacy, even if you didn't know it." "And the lawsuit?" "A mistake," she admitted. "When the museum exhibition called you the most innovative voice in modern puppetry, something broke in me. I'd spent 20 years studying their techniques, and you mastered them in weeks without even knowing what you were doing." As she turned to leave, I called after her. "Veronica, the things you wrote in your notebooks about the joint mechanisms, the modifications to make them more fluid, those weren't in my parents' original designs, were they?" She paused. "No, those were mine. Small contributions. They were valuable," I acknowledged. "That floating joint system changed everything about how the puppets moved." Something like gratitude flickered across her face before she composed herself and walked away, surrounded by her legal team, into a crowd of reporters shouting questions. Outside the courthouse, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages and calls. The story was spreading rapidly through the arts community. Not just my vindication, but the discovery of my connection to the legendary Merrick puppet makers. Galleries that had distanced themselves during the lawsuit were suddenly eager to host exhibitions. Theaters reaffirmed commissions. Documentary filmmakers proposed new projects. But amid the professional chaos, I felt strangely calm. For the first time in my life, I had context for my abilities, understanding why creating puppets had always felt like remembering rather than learning. The hands never forget, even when the mind does. 1 week after the trial concluded, I received a package at my studio. Inside was a worn leather case containing faded photographs of my parents, technical drawings in my father's hand, and a letter from my mother addressed to me on my 6th birthday, a birthday she didn't live to see. With them was a note from Veronica. "These belong to you all along. I kept them safe until you were ready. This is the last of what I gathered about your parents over the years. Their legacy is now entirely in your hands, where it belongs." There was no signature, no return address. The final act in our strange, intertwined story. I opened a new exhibition 3 months later, not of my own work, but of restored pieces created by my birth parents, alongside the 3 original puppets that had started everything. In the center of the gallery, I placed a collaborative piece, one of my designs incorporating the floating joint system Veronica had developed. The placard read, "In puppet artistry, we all build upon what came before. This piece honors the Merrick legacy, with recognition of contributions by Veronica Preston." It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, the thing she had wanted all along. My revenge wasn't destroying her, but reclaiming my story while still making space for truth. The exhibition catalog included the full narrative, how my parents' innovations had been preserved, how their techniques lived on through my work, and how even Veronica's misguided actions had ultimately served to unite me with my heritage. Critics called it the most powerful artistic origin story of our time. On opening night, as crowds filled the gallery, I stood before a photograph of my parents, holding puppets remarkably similar to those I now created. A reporter approached, recorder in hand. "How does it feel to discover your artistic DNA so dramatically?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. Like finding the missing piece of a puppet, the joint that makes everything else move correctly. I always knew how to make things come alive. Now I know why. And Veronica Preston? Any comment on her current situation? I shook my head. Her story is hers to tell. Mine is here, in this room, connecting past to future. As the reporter moved away, I noticed a figure at the back of the gallery, silver-streaked hair, familiar posture. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded room. Veronica gave a slight nod before disappearing through the exit. Some stories end with dramatic confrontation, others with quiet acknowledgement. Mine ended with reclamation of my history, my talent, and my future. The orphaned daughter of puppet makers had found her way home, guided by the very hands that had tried to claim her birthright. In puppet theater, we say the true artist disappears while the puppet lives. Perhaps that's the most fitting end to this story. Not the people behind it, but what we created that will outlive us all. If this story of reclaimed legacy and artistic justice moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more tales of vindication and rediscovery. In the comments, I'd love to know, what family talents or traits have you inherited that connect you to your past? Have you ever discovered something about your heritage that changed how you see yourself? Your stories and support help this channel continue bringing these deeply human narratives to life. Thank you for listening to Diana's journey of reclaiming what was always rightfully hers.